Sociopathy is a personality disorder that manifests into extremely antisocial attitudes and behaviors, and those affected by the disorder are often considered to be lacking a social conscience. Some of the attitudes and behaviors most often associated with sociopathy include a grandiose sense of self, acts of manipulation, pathological lying, a lack of guilt or shame, and general unreliability. This brings us to Jeff Kinney's popular children's book series, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, and his main protagonist, Greg Heffley, the titular Wimpy Kid. On the surface, these books appear to be simple comic books with a comedic focus on the cringe-inducing blunder years of middle school. But upon closer examination, there seems to be a lot more to Greg Heffley's character than meets the eye. Of the 13 traits used to diagnose people with sociopathy, Greg exhibits 12 of them. This has led my colleague Bedhead Bernie and I to believing that the lovable protagonist of this best-selling children's series is actually an emerging sociopath. This may sound a bit far-fetched at first, but as the points go on, you may become convinced. Number 1. Grandiose sense of self. Grandiosity is a term that usually refers to a person's false delusions of grandeur. While this trait often resides in narcissists, it's not solely limited to them. Grandiosity is usually when a person expects to be recognized for their importance, despite not truly having done anything worthwhile or extraordinary. This is often exhibited in a person through their over-exaggeration of achievements, feats, and accomplishments. Greg Heffley fits very nicely under this label. Greg is a character who thinks very highly of himself and is obsessed with the world around him recognizing his greatness. He often lies about his credentials and accomplishments in order to impress his peers and prove his greatness. In the original book, when Greg's friend Rowley started receiving attention for having a broken arm, Greg tries to impress his classmates by claiming that he also had an injury, which was untrue. In Double Down, Greg attempts to impress a college student he had just met by saying he was an expert in psychology. Such blatant lies in order to receive praise and respect occur repeatedly throughout the series. The plot of the majority of the Wimpy Kid books revolve around Greg's desire to become famous. Greg views himself as someone who will become famous in the future, and he envisions that his friends and family members will become leeches that mooch off of his popularity. He even goes so far as predicting that his best friend Rowley will cash in by writing a book about his experiences with Greg as a child. Greg's expectation of popularity is the whole reason he began writing his diary in the first place. He expects to be so popular in the future that he would be too busy or important to answer questions from the public. Greg uses his obsession with fame and popularity as a justification for looking down on other people. He ranks himself on an imaginary popularity scale against all of the other kids in the school district. In Greg's mind, the higher you are on the scale, the more value you hold as a human being. In Double Down, Greg recounts a story about a special education group he was put in called the Champs. He depicts himself and the other kids in the group as being the cool ones who would be praised by the other students during recess. In reality, this is likely just an exaggeration Greg created to impress the reader. Greg's view of himself is so high that he seems to suspect that his life in particular has some kind of ulterior, greater meaning. Very much akin to the psychological phenomenon known as the Truman Effect, Greg believes his life is potentially a secret television show where viewers at home are watching him constantly. Greg depicts this belief with a very bizarre image of his mother after giving birth, with Greg staring into a mirror, talking to his audience. These delusions of grandeur and importance make up the very fabric of Greg's character. Number 2. Manipulative and conning. To be manipulative and conning is to be a person that will take advantage of other people for self-gain, oftentimes humiliating them in the process. These people don't view others with respect, and instead see them as tools for achieving personal success. A tool is an accurate description of how Greg views his supposed best friend, Rowley Jefferson. Rowley Jefferson is a kind-hearted, chubby, dorky boy whose social failings, and sometimes even successes, rest entirely upon his desire to be and express himself in ways that might not flow with the mainstream. Naturally, Greg views Rowley as an idiot, someone he is above, both mentally and physically, and Greg considers himself to be higher than Rowley on his imaginary popularity scale. While Rowley isn't the brightest character, he definitely doesn't deserve the harsh treatment that Greg gives to him. Greg constantly belittles him, acts as a superior rather than a peer, and even tricks the boy for his own amusement. In the first book, Greg manipulates Rowley into riding down a large hill on a children's bicycle while Greg would try to hit him with a football as he rode past. When he finally manages to hit Rowley, he ends up accidentally breaking the boy's arm, thus forcing him to wear a cast. The injury brings Rowley some attention, and he starts becoming a bit more popular because of it. Greg sees this and attempts to use Rowley's injury to gain popularity for himself. As you would expect, this backfired. In the book Dog Days, Greg tries to start a lawn mowing service to earn money in order to pay a bill he owes to Rowley's father. Despite this service being Greg's idea in order to pay for Greg's bill, Greg attempts to trick Rowley into doing all of the labor that came with the job. This is just one example of many that show Greg's malicious manipulations in action. This antisocial behavior is no secret. Even Greg Heffley's Wikipedia page references his constant manipulations. Greg's best friend is Rowley Jefferson, who takes part in Greg's schemes, and is sometimes a victim of Greg's manipulation and deception. Greg is only friends with Rowley for selfish reasons. Rowley is almost always wrapped into his schemes and gets the short end of the stick. Greg's toxic relationship with Rowley is evidence enough that his manipulative and conning behaviors are out of control. Number 3. Superficial Charmer. A superficial charmer, also known as an insincere charmer, is when someone attempts to charm or manipulate someone for an unclear or ulterior motive. Greg often fails at charming his peers at school, but it isn't for a lack of trying. He is most successful at charming his family, particularly his parents. He constantly makes empty promises to his parents in exchange for items that often relate to a new trend or gimmick that he then abandons almost immediately. The weightlifting machine, the French horn, the dog, these are all things that Greg impulsively asked his parents to buy and then almost immediately abandoned. He charmed them with his promises of new activities, skills, and hope. And then when the item in question didn't immediately render the results he expected, he disregards the items and moves on to his next scheme. One of the few successful charms Greg had with a peer involved the character Fregley, the weird kid who lives in Greg's neighborhood. In the first book, after getting in a fight with Rowley, Greg intends to pretend he is friends with Fregley in order to make Rowley jealous. Fregley is a friendless boy who is desperate for companionship and camaraderie. So when Greg approaches him with the offer of becoming best friends, Fregley takes the bait. Greg, of course, has no intention of actually being friends with the boy, as his ulterior motive is to make Rowley jealous. And this vile charming leads Fregley to feeling more friendless and alone than ever before. Greg fed on Fregley's vulnerability, and he had a feast. Number 4. Pathological Liar. Greg is extremely elaborate in his lies and beliefs, and often gets caught up in them. He'll go on and on about things that simply cannot be true. For example, in The Third Wheel, Greg claims to remember the time that he spent in his mother's womb. This is impossible, as many scientific studies have proven that a person cannot remember anything from when they were a fetus. It is clear that Greg is lying here in order to evoke some sense of intellectual superiority over the reader due to his impressive memory. While Greg wants to prove his intelligence to the reader, he often attempts to underplay it with his teachers in order to get placed into easier curriculums. In an elaborate scheme he'd planned, Greg attempted to throw a test by pretending to be illiterate with a children's book. If his plan had succeeded, then Greg would have been placed in an easier class, but thankfully the teachers were able to see through this deception. Greg also lies to his parents and oftentimes humiliates them when things get out of hand. In the book Double Down, Greg lies to his mother by saying a bully at school would eat his fruit. He elaborated on the lie, describing to his mother in great detail about the physical appearance of this bully. His mother believed everything and went to the school board seeking justice for her son, only to find out that Greg had lied. These are just a few of the hundreds of examples of elaborate, complicated lies that Greg tells throughout the course of the series. Number 5. Lack of guilt or shame. Greg almost never regrets his actions unless they have a negative consequence for him. He often doesn't try to relate or empathize with other students, which seems to contribute to the idea of his peers being obstacles to his goal of popularity. The most iconic instance of Greg causing pain and turmoil for other people and feeling no guilt or shame whatsoever occurs in The Long Haul. Greg's family is on vacation and they are keeping their belongings in a locker at a pool. And when the key to the locker goes missing, Greg accuses another family of stealing both the key and their items. When Greg's family returns home from the trip, Greg realizes that the locker key was in his pocket all along, but he feels no guilt or remorse for throwing the other family under the bus. Even when Greg broke Rowley's arm in the first book, he felt no remorse at all, instead feeling jealous that his friend was receiving attention for the injury. This is a common theme throughout all of the books. Greg brushes off his mistakes and only feels shame when the consequences of his actions personally affect him. Number 6. Shallow emotions. Greg rarely shows compassion or joy to other characters in the series. The iconic blank stare he makes is all too common. It's used so much that just the frown is enough to identify his character. It's very rare that Greg draws himself as being happy or joyful, and these instances are almost always when he is doing it with a large group. Here Greg is likely partaking in a superficial charm, going along with the emotions of those around him in order to fit in with the popular kids and raise his score on the popularity chart. Unless he is attempting to charm or manipulate somebody, Greg almost never expresses a wide range of emotions to other people. Number 7. Need for stimulation. Typically, the term need for stimulation refers to gambling or drug abuse, but another vice that fits the term is a need for causing physical abuse. In many books, Greg writes how he wishes he could beat and abuse his younger brother Manny by means of practical jokes or destroying his creations. Thankfully, Manny is often protected by the watchful eyes of their parents. Unable to receive stimulation this way, Greg turns to abusing his friend Rowley, taking advantage of his lower intelligence by playing practical jokes on the boy that often end in serious injuries. This addiction will likely translate into an adult life riddled with domestic abuse against any poor woman unlucky enough to find herself in a relationship with this twisted boy. Number 8. Lack of empathy. Greg's lack of empathy has been a cornerstone of the other traits thus far. There are numerous examples of Greg's inability to recognize or sympathize with the pain he causes the other characters. Greg writes about how he felt very upset upon being removed from the Champs, and that being an outcast caused him pain. However, he feels no empathy whatsoever for the character Fregley, the biggest outcast in the school, and Greg seems to resent the boy even after using him and playing with his emotions. Greg makes it clear that when he was younger, his brother Roderick would bully him, often breaking his toys and trying to humiliate him. Although he understands how painful this position can be, Greg inflicts the same exact pain and abuse upon his younger brother Manny and his friend Rowley. It is clear that Greg has an unhealthy lack of empathy and, as a result, hypocrisy. Number 9. Impulsive nature. Greg's impulsive nature has already been touched upon in the superficial charmer section, but it goes even deeper than impulsively begging his parents to buy something for him. Greg doesn't always think before he speaks, and will do things without realizing the consequences. This happened with Rowley's father's membership to the country club, where Greg would constantly order drinks assuming that they had already been paid for. This impulsive behavior landed both Greg and Rowley's father in hot water. In the first book, after being sprayed with water by a group of teenagers, Greg impulsively yells that he is going to call the police. This led to a chase that ended with Greg and Rowley hiding out in his grandma's house while the teenagers vandalized her property. Greg constantly gets into situations like this where the people around him fall victim to his inability to think before he acts. And he, of course, almost never shows remorse for these behaviors. Number 10. Juvenile delinquency. An important trait used for identifying sociopaths is stated like this. He usually has a history of behavior and academic difficulties, yet gets by conning others. Problems in making and keeping friends. Aberrant behaviors such as cruelty to people or animals, stealing, etc. Does this sound familiar to you? Because to me it sounds like an almost perfect description of Greg Heffley. Greg is horrible at school, often slacking off and wishing that he got into a lower level class. He once slept through an entire period, only to wake up in the middle of the next. He's conned others before, and tried to use his brother's old essay to trick the teacher into giving him a good grade. He's had many issues keeping his only friend, and his mistreatment of Rowley often leads to fights and arguments that end in long breakups. Greg has also admitted to stealing many times throughout the diaries, and hid a relative's diamond ring so that when she died, others wouldn't be able to find it. Number 11. Unreliability. Greg has a horrible memory and often forgets to do simple things that lead to detrimental results. He is also irresponsible and is willing to destroy other people's reputations to save his own skin. This happened with the safety patrol, where he bullied kindergartners and chased them with worms. At one point, he forced them to climb and hide in a hole that was made in a construction area. A neighbor saw this and assumed that it was Rowley who had terrorized the children. Greg didn't correct them, and Rowley was forced to resign and apologize to the kids. At a school play, Greg had an extremely simple role. He was to literally play a tree and stand still for most of the show. Somehow, he was able to mess even this simple task up. He completely derailed the show, and at one point threw a prop at the main lead. The main actor became upset and attacked Greg, devolving the play into a fight. Greg felt no remorse for wasting the time and effort his peers had put into the show, and instead wrote about how proud he was of this achievement. Number 12. Criminal versatility. Criminal versatility refers to a person changing their image as needed to avoid prosecution. They can change their life story readily. I think you can see where this is going. Greg has supposedly been in middle school for more years than possible. It seems he hasn't aged in the whole series. He's had 2 summers and remained in the same grade. This is where my true theory kicks in. Greg Heffley changes his story in the diary to make himself seem more important, seem more interesting for when the supposed public reads his stories in the future. This is supported by past events. Think back to the vacation photos he created in The Last Straw. He would Photoshop himself into images of others having fun, so his life wouldn't seem lame. Greg claims to have memory from when he was in the womb. He draws himself in the womb able to speak, and claims he would do backflips. This is physically impossible without injuring himself, which he fails to mention. Conclusion. It is clear that Greg Heffley displays all of the telltale signs of a highly functioning sociopath. These traits can't all be coincidences. The author of the book series, Jeff Kinney, has stated on Reddit that he doesn't believe Greg is a sociopath since he views Greg as an extension of himself. This clearly incriminates Jeff Kinney as being a sociopath himself. This works one of two ways. Obviously, Jeff doesn't want people to think of him as a sociopath, and since he publicly claims that he and Greg are the same, he lies about Greg not being a sociopath in order to clear his name. On the other hand, perhaps Jeff is a sociopath and doesn't know it. If he is aware of all of these antisocial traits that both he and Greg display, and he somehow thinks that they're okay traits to have, then Jeff Kinney is very obviously a sociopath as well. Hey everybody! The research and editing for this video was done by my friend Bedhead Bernie. Go check out his channel after this video. He's got lots of great stuff on there.